Sejam bem-vindos a essa primeira atividade do ano do GEPAD. E estamos aqui hoje com a presença do Dr. Jamie Morrison, que é o secretário da Cúpula dos Sistemas Alimentares. O Jamie esteve conosco em 2018 na conferência Agri-Urb, Agricultura e Alimentação em Sociedades Urbanizadas. E quando eu soube que ele estava com essa função importante na organização da conferência, eu fiz um convite e ele gentilmente aceitou. Vou passar a palavra para o Jamie Morrison. Ele vai falar durante uns 20, 25 minutos e depois a gente abre para perguntas.
Thanks very much, Sergio. Good morning to everybody, and thanks very much for this opportunity to talk to you about the Food Systems Summit. As Sergio was saying, at least as far as I can understand, I'm part of the Food Systems Summit Secretariat on a part-time basis, and I'm responsible for the work of the action tracks and the scientific group, which I'll talk about as we go through the presentation. But I also wear another hat. The screen behind me indicates that I'm actually at FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, where I'm the director of the Food Systems and Food Safety Division. So what I'll try to do today is just take you through what we're trying to achieve with this Food Systems Summit, the structure that's been put in place, and then focus in on providing an update on where we are with the different parts of the process. I'll start with what we're trying to achieve in terms of the outcomes of the summit. Essentially, this is not a normal UN summit in that there won't be any negotiated outcome documents. In other words, documents negotiated by member states in the same way as we see in other UN fora. But there will be a statement of action provided by the Secretary General of the United Nations. And the idea is that this statement of action will set out the challenges and the opportunities that we face with respect to food system transformation, and then outline some of the areas of action which have been identified in the process leading up to the summit. And that process, as many of you may know, has been ongoing for about 2 years now. And it's a very intensive process involving lots of people. So there's lots going on behind the scenes. And we hope that by the time we reach the summit in September, that we'll have a very strong statement of action, which is backed up by national commitments to advance the pathways within their own context, their own national context. This is very important. Many member states have made it very clear to us that what they don't want is a conference which has generic recommendations. They need a conference which helps them to take forward the transformation of systems within their particular context. So we need that government commitment, and I'll explain a bit about how we'll try to do that as I go through the presentation. But it's also not just about governments. We're trying to ensure that this is an inclusive summit. It's a so-called People's Summit. So the process has been structured in a way which enables us to connect with all different constituencies, from research and academia, other parts of civil society, private sector, governments, UN organizations, in order to get as rich a package of actions as we can, and actions which are relevant, not actions which everybody's going to agree with. We know the complexities of food systems and some of the disagreements, but actions which can be taken forward by coalitions of actors rather than by individual actors. And we also see this summit as just being one event as a point in time. We're using it to generate a momentum behind food system transformation, but it's really what happens after the summit which is important, which will make the change, not what's discussed in the lead up to the summit. So we need some way of maintaining that momentum. So a lot of effort is going into trying to put in place and link communities who can take this process forward post-summit. And in order to help us do that, there will be some form of follow-up and review mechanism. This isn't meant to replace the SDG framework and the indicators and targets within that. It will be aligned, but it's more to help those actors who are making these commitments adapt as they go along through the decade. Whatever we put on paper in September, things are going to change. We'll have another shock to the system. We need to adapt as we go along. So we need some follow-up mechanism which helps actors to take these actions forward. So that's basically what we're heading towards. In order to get us there, a very complex structure has been put in place. I'm not going to go through all of the detail of this, but just to pick out a few highlights of this structure, which I'll then talk about in a bit more detail. There is an advisory committee. This is chaired by the Deputy Secretary General. It includes representatives of the food-based agencies in Rome, FAO, the World Food Programme, IFAD, but also representatives of the private sector, of civil society, of indigenous peoples, and of member states themselves. There's a representative from each of the UN regions on this advisory committee. It's not a decision-making body, but it provides advice as we go through the process and build up towards the summit. But the real action takes place under the leadership of Agnes Kalibata, who is the special envoy to the Secretary General for this summit. She's responsible ultimately for making it all work. And beneath her sits a secretariat of about 20 people. Many of us seconded on a part-time basis, but supporting this process as we go forward. The main components of the process, however, are the bits in the middle. So we have a scientific group. The idea here, I'll talk a bit more about the scientific group a bit later, because I think this should be of particular relevance. But the idea here was that the Secretary General did not want a summit which produced ideas and actions which were not based in science and evidence. So an independent scientific group has been set up under the chairmanship of Joachim von Braun of the University of Bonn. And it includes about, I think, almost 30 independent scientists covering the different regions of the world, but also different thematic areas of expertise. And I'll talk a little bit more detail about what their task is, but essentially it's to make sure that we move towards a summit with some solid basis, which lets us talk about the ambition that's needed, the feasibility, and also help in the design of the actions. And then the second element is the action tracks. This is where we have the so-called global level discussion going on. Although I don't like the word global, I only use it to distinguish it between the discussions happening within countries. Action tracks, 5 of these have been set up. I'll touch on these in a bit more detail in a moment. But their main task is to help identify and operationalize so-called game-changing solutions. So actions that need to be taken to move food system transformation forward in different contexts. And these game-changing solutions can be of different types. They can either be solutions whereby we just do things better, things we know already that need to be done, but we do that better by better coordination, by using innovations, innovative technology, innovations in the way we do things. So that's one set, and many of the game changers fit into that category. They're not particularly surprising. They're things we know should happen, but they're not happening for whatever reason. But then there's also a different set of game changers, which is more about changing the rules of the game. So these can relate to, for example, one contentious topic obviously is trade. How do we look at trade systems and the rules around trade which may govern what can be done in light of food system transformation? Others may be changes needed at the national level in terms of the governance of food systems. For example, do we need the creation of food policy councils in municipalities to help govern urban food systems. So these sort of changes to institutions and the institutional setting are also another type of game-changing solution. The work of the action tracks is underpinned by some so-called levers of change. And basically, these are finance, innovation, gender empowerment, and human rights. And the idea is that the game changers will be operationalized on the one hand through financing, through innovation, but on the other hand, they have to be and take into account the importance of gender empowerment, not just looking at the impacts of these game changes on different gender categories, but also using the power of those categories which isn't being well used at the moment to drive these solutions forward. And similar with human rights. I think this is a challenging area of work because often it pushes against the mainstream thinking with respect to food system transformation. But we see it as increasingly important to ensure that we've got the human rights dimension, particularly the right to food, but also the right to decent employment and so on, well embedded within this process. So that's the second part that I'll talk about in a bit more detail. I'll mention the Champions Network, but I'm not going to talk about this any further in the presentation. A Champions Network basically has been put in place to ensure that this process is inclusive and it's well understood by the broad public. So the task of the champions is to go out with their networks and their constituencies, explain what's happening, give voice to those who feel they don't have voice, and to feed that back into the process. The fourth chunk is the food system dialogues, and I'll come back to this later because I think this is another one where groups such as your own can become directly involved in the process. And these take place at different levels. There are member state dialogues, global dialogues, and independent dialogues, but I'll come back. And then the fifth one finally is the UN task force. Again, this came at the request of the Secretary General's office, who indicated that he didn't want a summit which was all about FAO, WFP, and IFAD, the Rome-based agencies. He wanted this as a system-wide agenda. So we have, I think in the UN, there are about 50 different organizations, and we have about 35 of those actively involved in this process through that task force. Everything from international property rights to civil aviation, to UN environment, UN habitat, and of course FAO, WFP, and IFAD, a whole spectrum. And I think this is really important for how we move forward after the summit. So let me just go into a bit more detail on some of those. I mean, maybe just to point out that the pre-summit event will happen in Rome, 19th to 21st of July, and the summit hopefully in September during the UN, the UNGA week. So the action tracks, I mean, you may have seen this, some of you before, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. The action tracks are structured around the 5 key objectives of what we're trying to achieve to get to the outcomes that we want. And these are fairly standard and obvious at one level. So you have access to safe and nutritious food, shifting to sustainable consumption, boosting nature-positive production, advancing equitable livelihoods, and increasing resilience to shocks. And this structure has been put together to make things manageable. We recognize that there are many trade-offs and linkages between these different objectives, but to make things manageable, the action tracks were structured around these, but at the same time, they're making a lot of effort to make sure they're talking to each other so that if action track 1 is developing a solution to reduce hunger, that it's also taking into account the potential impacts of that strategy on social and environmental indicators in relation to food systems. So we're hopefully get a joined up approach. I'll also highlight at this stage the bullet points under each of these. these are the working groups which give a bit more substance to the work of the action tracks. And they've also, as I'll come to on the next slide, they've also emerged as the areas of action under which the game-changing solutions will be clustered. So this chart gives a bit of an idea of the process which started properly last September. This was when the action tracks were set up, and which will lead through to the summit. So essentially, as I said before, we've tried to make this an inclusive process. So it's not just a group of people sitting together as part of an action track team trying to dream up these solutions or actions. It's a team which takes on board ideas which are provided by all different constituencies, all parts of the world, as to what they think needs to be done to achieve these objectives. So far we've received over 2,000 so-called game-changing solutions. These are ideas which have been submitted to the action tracks, mostly through online surveys, but also individually from governments, for example, from all over the world. So it was very much a process early on of sort of listening to what people were saying and starting to sift through those ideas to see what could be taken forward in a feasible way to have impact. So where we are now is the second level up. We have about 100 game-changing solutions which have been developed in some detail and which are felt to be feasible to take forward, but also should have an impact and should be sustainable over time. These are, as I've said, clustered under action areas, 15 action areas, which are the ones, basically the ones I listed on the previous slide. And hopefully by having these action areas, we start to see the merging of the action tracks to get behind 10 key outcomes that we're trying to achieve. I'll flick onto a slide which outlines these outcomes in a moment. And we would then further develop these game changes as we move towards the pre-summit and the summit, with a view to, from October onwards, operationalizing and putting those in place. I'm happy to share the slides afterwards, so don't worry too much about the detail. But just to highlight that there are 10 outcomes which have been articulated. These are the outcomes for the action tracks to focus on, not the outcomes for the summit as a whole. But they range from all people having adequate income to secure food so they're free for hunger. I read an interesting interview that Graziano da Silva had given a few days ago, which made it exactly this point. You know, the point he keeps making, I think, is that the simple solution is to make sure people have enough income to purchase or to access a healthy diet. And then you're a long way there to solving the issue of hunger. It's just, how do we do that? Is it through social protection? Is it through somehow reducing the price of food which is considered to be healthier or more nutritious? Of course, there are many challenges around that. And so we have many other outcomes of a similar nature. How do we ensure that food is safe? How do we ensure that it's more emphasis is put on healthy food versus the unhealthy food, and so on? So that's the work of the action track. And in terms of inputs which can still be received, the online surveys, and I'll provide links at the end of this end of the presentation, are available and will be open until the end of this month, end of April. So there's still a possibility to submit a 1 or 2 page idea. It's quite easy to fill in the form if you still think something's missing from the package which has been put forward together so far. So that was the action tracks. Very quickly on the scientific group, as I said before, this is an independent scientific group put together to ensure that we're basing the discussions and dialogue on science and evidence. And yeah, we found this to be really important given the some of the quite divisive discussions around, for example, the transition to reduce consumption of meat, for example. What is the science behind that? What is the impact of doing that in different parts of the world, both on the nutritional status of people? Obviously, it depends if we're talking about overconsumption or underconsumption, but also on the production systems which are in place to produce that particular product. And from there, the trade systems which are in place to allow that product to flow. So we need good science to help us to think through what makes sense in terms of these solutions. A lot of us have ideas about, okay, we reduce meat consumption, for example, that's going to help us with reduction in global greenhouse gases. But what does the evidence really say about that and how that weighs up against our objectives of trying to achieve improved nutritional status, for example? So the science is really important, and the scientific group have been mobilized to bring that science together behind these difficult issues. They're also performing a role of providing some form of assessment of the solutions which are being generated by the action tracks. Again, this is not an easy process because sometimes you want to push forward ideas in the action tracks which are new and where science doesn't necessarily exist. But you also want ideas which are talking to constituencies which rely on different forms of evidence. So, for example, we have a large part of the discussion in the summit is in relation to indigenous food systems and what we can learn from those types of systems. But also, what we can learn from urban food systems in different parts of the world, how we can share that. So there are different types of science and evidence which need to be brought in. And it's not always the case of bringing the sort of mainstream to the front of the line. We need to learn from the full spectrum. So the scientific group so far have generated a number of key outputs. They've generated a series of 5 papers, one for each of the action tracks. These are being revised. 2 of them, the final versions have just been put on the website for 2, and they're close to finalization for the other ones. There are also concept papers on, what does food system transformation mean? What is a healthy diet? And then there are 30 briefs in preparation. Again, some of these are already on the website, but these are tackling some of these difficult issues in the food system debate. The scientific group is also working on an agenda paper, which would be ready by the time of the summit, which would set out an agenda for the scientific community post-summit. So what is really needed? What are the gaps? What sort of relationships need to be put in place to strengthen science around food system transformation as we move past the summit? There will be some open science days before the pre-summit. So early July, FAO is hosting 2 science days, which will be open. They'll be virtual. So by that nature, it makes it easier to make them open to the scientific community. And that will be a chance to discuss some of what that group has been doing, but also how they perceive the content of the action tracks. And then my final slide is on the other key part of this process, which is the food system dialogues. So as I said before, there are 3 levels of dialogue. The one that we're most focused on as a secretariat is the dialogues which take place in each member state. Now, the ambition that we had from the beginning was that every UN member state would undertake a series of 3 dialogues in their country. So dialogue 1 would be a dialogue where some of the key issues and priorities facing that particular country were brought to the surface. The idea being that you have a multi-stakeholder discussion to try to bring some of these ideas to the surface. The second stage would then be going out to different constituencies within the countries to get their views and understandings and solutions around those key priority areas. And then the third stage would be the development of a pathway or roadmap for the country to move towards changes in food systems which might be required to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, after a fairly slow start, for some good reasons, we now have, I think as of today, 88 of the UN member states who have committed to undertaking this series of dialogues by appointing national conveners. So you'll see, if you can see the list, it's a bit small, the writing, but Brazil is on there as one example, along with Argentina, Chile. So yeah, a number of countries in the region have already appointed their national conveners. And yeah, to me, this is it's a really important part of the summit process because it allows us to start to think through some of the work which has taken place at that global level in the action tracks, in the reality of countries, of the context of the national context, where it's likely to be some combination of these solutions which may be needed or may not be needed, depending on the status within that particular country. Now, yeah, whether we'll get to our ambition of having all 190 countries, I doubt it, because some countries don't have the capacity. Other countries, it's been quite difficult for them to identify who their national convener should be. For some countries, it was obvious. It was the Minister of Agriculture. But for other countries, it's, well, is it the Minister of Agriculture, or do we need to look at the Ministry of Health or the Ministry of Commerce or the Ministry of Planning? Or do we need some sort of other infrastructure in place to bring these different parts of government together? And for some countries, that's taken 2 or 3 months to figure out, even some of the most advanced. I know in Germany, for example, this process has been ongoing to decide who, there's a willingness to do this, but deciding on the national convener has taken some time in a number of countries. And on the one hand, okay, for the summit, this is a little bit problematic because we only have a limited time. But on the other hand, it's very reassuring, I think, if we look at the future and how this process is taken forward, if it's being taken this seriously by countries. So that's the member state dialogues. At the global level, we have about 10 in total. So we've had one on energy so far. We've had one under the context of the One Planet Network on food system transformation more generally, which took place last year. And there are some upcoming on water, environment, and oceans. These are normally tied to big events in relation to these topics to try to bring in some food system thinking to the debates. And then the other very important type of dialogue is the independent dialogue. And the idea here is that anybody or any constituency globally can hold its own independent dialogue. This may be because it doesn't feel that its particular issue or topic is being taken up at the national level. It may be just a different grouping of organizations which want to take forward a certain point. So far, we have more than 180 of these dialogues which have been announced on the gateway, but I know that there is an exponential growth path in these just by nature of the ones that I'm familiar with, which hadn't been posted. So I think this will become a big element over the next few months. So if you visit that website, don't be surprised to see many dialogues which you could become involved in. I think it's a nice way of getting involved and getting your points across into a process. The outcomes of the dialogues are posted online by the convener of that dialogue, and then they find their way into a synthesis which finds its way back into the process. So there's quite a nice connection between them. But we're seeing a lot of energy now in that area. So that's basically all I had to say. As I said, I'll share these slides, but there is a lot of information behind what's happening, which can be accessed at these various websites, whether it's on the action tracks or the Food System Summit dialogues or the scientific group, for any further information. But I hope, Sergio, that sort of covers roughly what you were hoping, and open to any questions.
That's absolutely fine, Jamie. And thank you so much for share with us all this, this framework as the conference is taking. So it's giving us a bit better idea what's going on, who is who, and how things will ongoing after the conference.